As an only child, I spent a good portion of my youth in front of the television, and any television show from the 50s to maybe 68, I can tell you just about any show that was on, who was in it, producers, directors, so much, because I loved it as a child. I lived in front of the television and watched a lot of movies on TV, and went to the movies a lot. No one favorite. I'm trying to think of favorites from childhood. The old Frankenstein and the old Dracula were great pictures of Gothic. What other pictures really scared me as a child? God, I used to go to, I remember seeing 13 Ghosts, Psycho, of course, which is, character study more than a horror film. I remember seeing Psycho when it was released in '59. I used to like some of the William Castle, House on Haunted Hill I saw as a kid. A lot of the ones that I actually went to see as a kid, really stuck. And you go back to those pictures, what was Mr. Sardonicus? I don't know, it's a William Castle film, and it's funny. As a kid, it really scared me, and I really loved it. But during the 60s, it was a time of great upheaval, a time when people were very optimistic about changing the world and making it a better place, and rebelling against things as they were. And during that particular period, Sony introduced the half-inch black and white video Portapak. The power of the media is now in the hands of the people. With this little thing slung across your shoulder, you can go out in the streets. Anybody can make a movie about themselves, their community, their family, and that really became, as an art form, this is really going to change the world. We're going to take control of the means of production. We, the young artists of America, which was, an interesting dream. It didn't work out that way. So I transferred from fine art into television and moved from the University of Illinois in Champaign to Columbia College in Chicago. And what I wound up doing mostly was still photography, working on the streets of Chicago, which was something that I really enjoyed, working out in the street with real people, real lives, and there's people's stories. And after graduation from college, it was in 1972, there were no jobs in production in Chicago. So I wound up working in a factory for 19 months on an assembly line on the south side of Chicago, which is what my family connections were. Mostly out here in Los Angeles, I find so many of these kids working in the studios and working in the offices, their families were connected in some way, and they got them a job. My family was connected to working in factories, and they got me a job, and I worked there for 19 months. I was married, and then that fell apart, and I sort of hit the road for a few years and traveled with a traveling carnival, photographed it, wound up in New Orleans for a couple of years, built sailboats, I made jewelry for a living. I did many other things than the production business. Again, it was being someone who grew up in the 60s, we weren't looking for careers and jobs. We were looking for adventure and lives, and a whole different mindset. And eventually I came back to Chicago sort of resolved that now I'm going to just focus, and I'm going to eventually, be in the production business and make movies. I grew up in the South Side, and when I moved back to Chicago in whatever year it was, 1978, I was living in the south suburban region because it's where my parents had moved to, and I was working in a bar called Lassen's Tap, which indeed, by way of coincidence, we used as a location in the movie. And I was working for my late cousin, Brock Lassen, and one afternoon this guy came in and he pushed a card across the bar because I was working there temporarily trying to get myself back into the production business. Maljack was the name of their company at that time. So just, looking to re-hook myself into the production business, I called them. And at the time, this was before there was such a thing as VHS home video. And they were working out of their parents' basement in Oak Forest, Illinois, and I met them, and they were doing this, I forget the name of the unit, but it was this big black plywood box that ran Super 8 loops of old public domain Charlie Chaplin films, cartoons, and they would place them for a fee into bars and restaurants, and then once a week they would rotate the loop of film, would go from one bar to the next restaurant. And I did that for, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 months working for them and got to know them. And I was working nights at the bar still, and I was working, like 18 hours a day, and I finally got a little bit exhausted and didn't think that what they were doing down there was really leading to any sort of position in production, but we remained friends, and I parted their employ. We knew that the video cassette was coming and that it was going to be a major force in home entertainment in general. And sort of towards the end of my tenure, I think, is when they got involved. I think Grizzly Adams was their first title, and it was one of the very first titles to be put onto home video and marketed, put into the marketplace. And so we sort of had this dream, Waleed and I, someday we're going to make a movie, you know. And so time passed, I don't remember how long, it's been some years. But they got involved with a guy named Ray Atherton, who also has a role in the picture of Henry. So I got to know Ray, who was a real wheeler dealer and a real character. He was a huge man. And we became friends, and we got involved in some small projects together. And I came back to work for those guys, not as a day-to-day employee, but we did something called Dealers in Death. And Ray Atherton found all the footage of, it was gangsters, all this old, we found a lot of still photographs and a lot of documentary footage from the archives, and we got Broderick Crawford to narrate it. Ray wrote it, and it was just about gangsterism. And we made those, and MPI distributed them. And then we were going to go ahead and do another series. Someone had unearthed a cache of old wrestling footage, and this was when the WWF, World Wrestling Federation, was just starting to become a force, and wrestling had a big resurgence, professional wrestling. And I used to be a big fan as a kid. I found it very entertaining. In the old days in Chicago, when we had Killer Kowalski and Bobo Brazil and all these characters. And sort of at the last minute, the guys with the footage decided to change the deal. They had said, you know, we'll sell you the footage for X amount of dollars, and when it came time for MPI to write the check, they said, no, we want this much money. And those guys don't like to do business that way. And so they basically told them to stuff it. And I had been living in Los Angeles, and I was in Chicago to discuss this project with Waleed, and I was in his office, and he was sort of, you know, pretty upset with these people and saying, screw these guys, we're not, you know, they said this much money, and now they're saying this. I won't do business that way, and they can go to hell. And as an aside, he sort of turned to me and said, why don't we take the money and do what we said we were going to do years ago and make a movie? And it was sort of completely unexpected, you know, because I had been trying for years to get a little movie project off the ground, and without success, and I sort of was making my living with these little documentaries and figured, well, at least it's paying the rent, and I'll probably be doing this for a couple of years, and I will segue into movies when the opportunity arises. And this was the opportunity. So he said, listen, why don't we make a horror film? I'll give you $100,000, and you make a horror film. And I said, sure. I had no idea what the subject would be. You know, and I was sort of in shock. I hadn't expected this. This was my break. The first thing that sort of occurred to me, you know, I knew $100,000 wasn't a lot of money, but if he would have said, I'll offer you $10,000 to make a horror film, I would have said, I'm in, you know. And but I knew for that kind of budget, what could we do? We couldn't do big special effects. We couldn't do spaceships and monsters and traditional types of horror film fare. So I walked into Gus's office, and Gus has always been sort of a collector and of the arcane and the strange and the unusual and the weird. And in his office, he had, you know, stacks of books and videos and stuff. His name was Gus Kavouris. His name is Gus Kavouris. And Gus and I grew up together since little childhood, since little kids, grammar school, high school, and we'd been friends for many years. And he said, here, why don't you look at this? And he popped in a cassette, and it was a segment from the show 2020. And it was about a man named Henry Lee Lucas. And he was they actually had interviews with him and interviews with people that he'd supposedly stalked. And at this time, Henry Lee Lucas was claiming to have murdered 360 people with a partner named Otis Elwood Toole. And there was pictures of Otis, too, and there was pictures of the two of them, and they were the, you know, I looked at it, I said, if I saw these two guys walking down the street, I'd just run. I mean, they were the scariest looking pair you'd ever want to see. But there was something about Henry that had this sort of off-center charm where you could see how he could possibly get close enough to people to accomplish this. For the first time to my knowledge, I heard the term serial killer and some explanation of what a serial killer was. But this was sort of some sort of new sickness for our time, that people just went around and randomly picked victims and killed them. And it was tremendously creepy and tremendously horrifying. And it was sort of a new wrinkle on things. So based upon that, it became the germinal idea for making the picture. I was now presented with making a film, and I was conversant with post-production and video, but not at all in film. So I wound up, I'd known a person named Steve Jones, who was working for a company in Chicago named Sinnott & Associates, and Steve was directing animated commercials. Steve became one of the producers on Henry, and introduced me to a lot of the people that you know, brought a lot of people in, because he was much more connected into the Chicago production community. So anyway, he did indeed introduce me to Richard Fire. Then Richard and I sat down over a period of, I think it was in August, we started in August '85, and I think we wrote right up to when we started production, which was sometime in the autumn of '85. We tried to do something entirely new, and we came up with a couple of concepts. You know, we're making a horror film, and you know, we usually often involve monsters, and of course we don't have the money or the inclination to do some sort of outer space monster. Indeed, this character, you know, based on the true person that we've seen, is truly a monster, but a human being. And we came up with this concept, and we wrote a number of other treatments. At one point we thought we'd continue in the vein, called Modern Monsters. And we also thought that we would redefine the horror genre. Yes, we were trying to make a horror film, but we're going to try and make one unlike any other. And indeed go to the root of the idea, which is if a horror film's intent is to horrify, then let's horrify to the best of our abilities, in the extreme, was sort of the task we set ourselves. I had something that was a lot closer to exploitation than what Richard had in mind. Richard pushed it into a different direction. Than he's trying to find you know, something a little deeper, more, you know, meatier with the subject matter, and steered it in that direction. The book that Thomas Harris wrote before Silence of the Lambs was Red Dragon, and which was made into a picture called Manhunter. But the book Red Dragon was, in my estimation, the best psychological thriller that I'd ever read up to that point, and I stole freely from that book the idea of videotaping the murders in the Red Dragon book. It wasn't a matter of videotape, but the serial killer the killer in that book, Francis Dollarhide, worked in a film processing lab, and whenever he came across a family that fit basically the same profile as the family that he'd been raised in, that he would single them out. And since this was a central processing lab for a multi-state area, he would get in his van and then maybe drive hundreds of miles because he would know where this family lived after he saw the picture. We were looking for Henry's, and we were casting from Richard Fire's apartment. And the project was not looked upon with, it's very interesting to see what's happened since, but a lot of people who were in the theater sort of looked down their noses on this project at the time it was being put together. And we had one young actor who we liked, we offered the part to, and it came back he wasn't interested. It was too low for him. I've never seen or heard from this guy since. Then we had another actor who was a little bit older, who was a very good actor, came out of Chicago theater, and I don't remember his name. And we were getting close to offering him the part. He came and read. But he was older, he wasn't as handsome and dynamic as Michael, and the sexual relationship, the tension between he and Becky would have been more like father-daughter. It just wasn't going to. And then our makeup man, Jeff Siegel, who did our special effects makeup, had been involved a little bit in theater and had directed a play, and he said, I know this guy, his name is Michael Rooker, he's a really good young actor, and you know, I've worked with him in a play, and he's perfect for this, you should see him. I said, fine, we'll see anybody. And we were in Richard's apartment, and then there was a knock on the door one day, and I went to open the door, and this Michael walked in, and he was, except for his shoes and socks, he was wearing the clothes that he would wear in the movie. Those were his clothes, that brown jacket and the sort of worker's pants, and I don't remember the shirt exactly. And I just, like, my mouth dropped when I saw him, and I This is true. I said a little prayer to myself, oh God, please let him be able to act, because physically this guy is it. And Michael came in, he was very much in character, which made him pretty strange, and he read with that voice that he's got, and I just went, so we were very polite, and Michael was behaving a little strangely because he was in character, and it's like, and my next thought is like, I hope he's acting, hope this isn't his true self, which it certainly isn't. Michael's very different from that character, and I waited till Michael left. And he was also offered a role in some Steppenwolf production at the time. And of course, Steppenwolf was prestige, and we were just like, these goofs. And he walked out the door, and I listened to make sure that I heard him hit the elevators. And I ran to the phone and picked it up, and I said, book this guy. He's going to be a movie star. While I was in film school, people like, and of course he's still alive, knock on wood, Kurosawa was, Fellini was working, Bergman was working, Truffaut was working, Godard was working. Those pictures were in the theaters at that time. And the whole cinema verite style was something that I really loved because of having done a lot of still photography on the street. I loved working in the streets. I loved the city of Chicago for its texture and for its neighborhoods and for its grittiness and for all the great looks and feels that it had. So I was very much interested, even though we're making a horror film, we're making it in an art film style, on the streets. We shot a scene with Becky comes out of the L, whatever. She comes up the stairs out onto the streets of Chicago, and there were these two guys speaking, I'm not sure what language it is, it may have been Greek, and they were standing there and they refused to move. And they were having this big conversation. So he said, because we didn't know any of the union regulations, what you could and couldn't do, and so those two guys are in the scene, and they were oblivious. We were filming a scene with them standing there continuing their conversation, and you can't do better than that, So that was very much a part of the Henry style, was a cinema verite, and that was the intent, and often people refer to it as, as semi-documentary in style. People have often asked me, if you had more money, what would you have done differently? And I have to say, the film was written to that budget, and the difference between low budget and high budget, full budget studio pictures, and I've certainly done both. In a low budget, you sort of have to tailor the script to the budget. But in big budget, you're assured of having enough, well, this is what I want to do, you storyboard it out, and then you build the sets to accommodate, or you find the locations and dress them to accommodate, and you sort of can control your environment. In low budget, you again have to write to the budget. We would have our day's work lined up, and it was like, we would go out and shoot till it was done. There was no overtime. And the group of people, it was a very small group of people. Our crew on any given day would, be no more than 3 to 5 people, and the actors. So if I had to do over, the only thing I would do is pay people more, because the picture, it looks the way it should look for what it is, to tell the story that it's telling. It took us 28 days to shoot the picture, and it was 28 consecutive days. There were no days off. And I think it must have been late October, because I think we finished right before Thanksgiving, if memory serves. We shot there was one particular day that we shot 23 hours straight through. We paid the lead actors each the fee, which was, for them was a reasonable amount of money. Now it's what they make, they make more in a day. Michael makes a lot more than that in a day. And we just didn't know any better, ignorance was bliss in our case. The great thing about the picture, in one sense, was that for the $100,000, we paid everybody who worked on that picture something. Whether it was $50 a day, they got the $50, and no one walked away, we left no bad debts, we left no bad tastes in anyone's mouth. We paid everybody what we bargained to pay them. The scene that disturbs me the most is the scene of the slaughter of the family that they videotape and then later play back for their entertainment. And that's sort of the key scene of the picture, I think, and one of the key things the picture is about, which we were trying to do something entirely different in terms of horror film and in terms of portraying violence. And although we were portraying, I find that often in horror films, the violence, and also in action films, what you often find, and we did it earlier in the film, Henry, you set up a character as a bad guy. And then you just have this person do all sorts of terrible things to the lead character or his wife or his child or whatever, or a dog, just to show you what a horrid person this is. So when it finally comes time for this character to get their comeuppance from, of course, the hero of the film, the audience is rooting to see this person killed, to see this person beaten, maimed, because he's got it coming. And it's sort of a purging thing. In the real world, violence, has a different face. And it's very ugly, and so we sort of set up in the early part of the film, here's your typical way of violence is portrayed. Henry and Otis go to buy a hot TV because they've kicked theirs in, and the big guy sitting there is Ray Atherton, who I described earlier, who was a video pirate and was a wheeler dealer extraordinaire. And he repeatedly insults these guys. Well, he doesn't know who they are, but the audience knows who they are. They're like murderous, killers. And so he's rude, he's abusive, he's insulting, and little by little you're looking at these guys and the audience knows it's like, no, don't do it. And finally the guy becomes so reprehensible that the audience is going, get him, Henry, get him, let him have it. And we do this big set piece with the soldering iron, the TV over the head, and it's violence, it's entertainment, and it's even funny.
Otis, plug it in.
But it's murder, it's cold-blooded, brutal murder. This is violence as entertainment. Now, let's, 15, 20 minutes later, let's have these two guys walk into a home of completely innocent people, family, and just brutally slaughter them. But let's shoot it from this little video camera, cinema verite, and then they play it back while they're sitting on their couch and watch it as home entertainment. I mean, there's something being said there. And the way it was filmed was you see the setup, then you see the camera, and then you start to witness the act, but you're witnessing it on videotape, and you assume you're witnessing it through the eyepiece as it's happening. But then the camera pulls back from the image and you realize it's not the eyepiece, it's the playback later, and it comes and shows you Henry and Otis. And you're there with them watching it. You are participating in watching this and being entertained by what is no longer fun, but what is really a really hideous and repulsive act. And it's a very uncomfortable moment for a lot of reasons. It's often been said that the picture has no moral point of view. It just presents this stuff, and why don't you solve the riddle for us? Why don't you tell us why they did it? Why did you let him get away? Why didn't you have the cops catch him? Why didn't you? There's no moral there's no moral resolution here, and to that scene being a key point, it's like you are forced. I'm not going to make moral decisions for you. I'll present you with a situation. I know how I feel about it, but I don't feel it's my place to tell you how to feel about it. What do you think? One of the first comments that came from after the first screening is like, you can't do that. And it's like, well, it's too late. It's already done. You have to have the police come and catch them because they've done all these horrid things. I go, why is that? We chose not to. I mean, that's the traditional way, and we were trying to break the rules. We were trying to push the boundaries of the horror film. And one of the things, after having watched the 2020 stuff on Henry Lee Lucas, and even though it's probably turned out mostly to not be true, he presented a scenario where they would kill somebody, he and Otis, and they were always mobile. They always had some kind of car. And he said, they would kill somebody, and by the time the body was discovered, they were across the state line. Consequently, they were looking for them where they'd been, not where they were. People will find this a horrible thing to say, but I think if you sit and watch Henry 5 times, by the 5th time, you will not be able to help yourself. It is very comedic in many ways, and also in the dialogue, Richard Fire and I, this sort of the poetry of idiocy. I mean, there's a certain idiotic, poetic quality to the choice of word, to the language that they speak. That's another thing, to be able to look at these characters that are so horrid and at the same time laugh. It's very conflicting to a viewer, and again, I hope makes you think, why am I laughing at, they're crashing a TV over a guy's head and stabbing him with a soldering iron. I mean, initially it wasn't intended as a theatrical film. It was intended to be transferred to video, and those guys, MPI would release it in the video marketplace. But very shortly into the production, all of us involved, we would go to Charlie Lieberman's house in the evening because he had a 16mm projector, and we'd look at the dailies. And it became pretty apparent to us that we had a movie. a movie that could be released. It looked really good. The performances were very strong. And we had it all in our hearts that we were making a movie, which was a great morale builder, too. So Chicago Film Festival gave us a Saturday afternoon slot, but there was no print, so we had to rent a video projection system. Rick Cogan of the Chicago Tribune was the first person to write about it, and Rick has been a real champion and did us a great service and went out of his way to champion and promote the picture. And it was shown in New York, and Elliot Stein, I believe, from The Village Voice happened to see it and wrote a huge piece on it. But it still was, sporadic. And then the Telluride Festival, that was where it really broke, because all the critics were there. Sis Ebert was there, it's a very pleasant festival in the mountains in Colorado, in a little town called Telluride. And it became a sensation there. And the first screening was the one where a good number of people at the what we call the home invasion scene. At that particular point, a lot of people were running for the doors. It was pretty shocking to realize that, the power of the medium. So it was interesting. We had a first screening, and a lot of people ran out the door. Then they scheduled a second screening, which was not originally scheduled, and only one person ran. And I think Michael, myself, and perhaps Steve went to introduce the film, and then we left to go get a beer at the bar while the film played, because we'd seen it a million times by then. And so we were coming back because we were going to answer questions afterwards. And we were standing in the lobby, and I remember the little portholes in the doors and we were looking in to see what part of the film it was, and it was the home invasion. And this young woman jumped up and started running for the door. And so Michael turns around, and she comes running out the door, and Michael just turns to her and he goes, "Boo!" It's like, and the girl, she just about wet her pants. She really freaked out. And Michael is indeed a very friendly, outgoing person with a big sense of humor. And he's a very kind person. So then he hugged her and said, I'm sorry. I just, blah, blah, blah. And she was okay. But it was kind of an interesting moment. I'm sure it was her worst nightmare. We always wanted to call it Henry. It seemed the perfect title. And then Waleed, or someone at MPI, showed me when they go to make sales in video, they said, it's just like there's Henry V, Henry VIII, Henry Aldrich, Henry this. If we just have Henry, it's. And he showed me a printout of all these titles and how it, in terms of sales, how it says you have to specify it. And so we made it Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, so it would be separate from Henry V and all the other Henry titles out there. I made a deal at a company called Atlantic Entertainment, to make a picture called The Borrower. And upon signing me to do this, they said, well, we loved your picture, Henry, that's why we hired you, and we'd love to take it out theatrically. The next day, we had a deal at Atlantic. So it was submitted to the MPAA while they were in Italy, and came back with the X. But an X rating was commercial death. There was no one that would exhibit your picture, and it was really not worth their while to try to take out an X-rated picture, because there were so few places you could play it. And for some reason, no one ever thought quite to that stage, because that was before the ratings changed, and Henry was one of the pictures that caused the ratings to change. After I made Henry, David Mamet sent me a very nice letter, Eric Bogosian sent me a very nice letter, and John Waters sent me a very nice letter. And I've actually worked with Eric since then. I made a picture called Sex, Drugs, Rock and Roll. I become friends with John Waters for the fact that I spent a lot of time in Baltimore, because I directed 5 episodes of Homicide, and a lot of the people that work in his regular group work on the show Homicide. And now getting to work with Mamet on Lansky, which it's just tremendous writing. It's hard to find writing that, well, it's more than hard. It's very rare. As a kid, you went to the movies, and movies were just the movies. You didn't, but going in school, realizing that there was film was also thought of by some as an art form, and that was quite a revelation. I saw a number of John Ford's pictures when he was still working, John Huston's pictures when he was still working. Again, Kurosawa, who's hopefully still working, but saw Fellini's pictures in their first release, and up to that time I saw just about everything Bergman made, and saw a number of Bergman's films when they were released, Godard's pictures, Truffaut's pictures. So those people were very influential on me, because they were, you know, there was that transition from movies as movies to movies as an art form. And over the last couple of years, because I spend so much time when I'm shooting, I have 2 to 5 monitors in front of me, which I watch 12 hours a day. And then I go in the cutting room and I watch 2 monitors for 10 hours a day. I don't go to the movies much anymore, unfortunately. I read, you know. That's my escape.